The wind howled outside like a banshee, its icy fingers curling around the worn cabin walls. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and bubbling broth. Alma stirred the pot, her wooden spoon scraping against the sides with a soft clink, echoing secrets in the silence. Shadows danced under flickering candlelight, whispering tales of vengeance as she prepared the feast. "Tonight they'll come," Alma murmured to herself, a sly smile curling her lips. "They'll come for what they think is a feast, but it will be their final supper." 15 years had passed since the villagers burned her sister Marin at the stake. The flames had licked at her skin, turning her into a charred offering to the gods of ignorance. Revenge is a dish best served cold, Marin had whispered before the flames consumed her, and Alma had sworn to make the villagers pay for their cruelty. Alma had always been the odd one, the strange girl with wild hair and a penchant for the unusual. Marin, with her warm smile and gentle laugh, was her opposite. An anchor in a stormy sea. The sisters shared a bond that transcended words, woven through the laughter of childhood, and the shared secrets whispered under moonlit skies. They had explored the dense forests together, danced in the rain, and dreamed of a future where they would be free from the shackles of the village's superstitions. But those dreams shattered one fateful night when a villager accused Marin of witchcraft, claiming her beauty and kindness masked a sinister heart. "She cast a spell on my son," the man had yelled, his voice rising above the crowd. Fear and ignorance fueled the mob, a living entity of rage and revenge, bent on punishing the innocent. Alma had fought to defend her sister, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of screams and chants. They dragged Marin away, and Alma's heart shattered as she watched, helpless, while the flames danced hungrily around her sister, consuming everything she was. Marin's last words echoed in her mind. "They'll pay, Alma. They'll pay in blood." For years, Alma had plotted her revenge, studying the ways of the forest, learning the secrets of herbs and roots. She became an expert in the art of deception, honing her skills while the villagers went about their lives, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in her heart. She learned how to prepare meals that would leave an unforgettable taste, a concoction that would lure them in and seal their fate. As dusk fell, a knock echoed through the cabin, a sharp rap that sent a shiver down Alma's spine. She opened the door to find 3 villagers, faces drawn and cold as the moonlight. They stepped inside, bringing with them the chill of the night. "Alma, we've come for the feast," one of them said, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "You're the talk of the village. They say you've outdone yourself this time." Alma smiled, a sly twist of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I have indeed. Sit, enjoy the warmth. The meat is nearly ready." They settled around the table, their breath visible in the cold air, as she ladled thick, steaming broth into bowls. The liquid sloshed, glug, 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 filling the room with its savory aroma. The villagers leaned in, eager for the warmth and comfort she offered, unaware of the true nature of the meal. "Is that lamb?" one asked, his eyes wide with hunger. "Something like that," Alma replied, her voice a silky whisper. "It's a special recipe, passed down through generations." As they feasted, the sound of chomp 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 filled the air, mingling with their laughter. They savored the meat, oblivious to the darkness hidden in every bite. Alma watched them with gleaming eyes, heart racing as the sweet taste of revenge filled her senses. "I must confess," she said, leaning closer, her voice low and conspiratorial. "This meat has a unique flavor, a hint of sweetness, wouldn't you agree?" They nodded, blissfully ignorant, the warmth of the broth enveloping them like a lover's embrace. As their laughter faded into quiet satisfaction, Alma felt a thrill surge through her. You wanted a feast, didn't you? Well, I made sure to prepare a real delicacy. The villagers looked up, confusion clouding their features. What do you mean? One stammered. Alma's smile widened, revealing teeth glistening in the candlelight. You see, my dear friends, revenge is indeed a dish best served cold, and you're the main course. In that moment, she lifted a small carving knife, its blade shimmering like ice. The realization hit them too late, but their screams echoed through the cabin as Alma descended upon them, the wind outside howling a wicked tune. The fire crackled, and the meat continued to roast, a grisly reminder of what had been served. Sweet, succulent revenge, savored in the darkness. As the villagers fought against their fate, Alma felt a strange sense of liberation. The years of pain, the nights spent mourning her sister, all washed away in this moment of dark triumph. She became the embodiment of her sister's vengeance, the rage of 1,000 nights manifesting in her swift movements and the sharp edge of her blade. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the walls, mirroring the chaos that ensued. Alma reveled in the fear in their eyes, the betrayal they felt, knowing too late the monster they had created. And when it was done, the cabin was quiet once more. The only sound, the crackling fire, and the distant howling wind. The villagers lay lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of horror and disbelief. Alma wiped the blade clean, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the savory aroma of the feast that was meant to be. This is what you wanted, she whispered to the air, as if her sister could hear her. This is for you, Moran. Alma carefully prepared the remains, her movements methodical and precise. She recalled every tale of cooking she had ever heard, every hint of flavor she had ever savored. The meat, tender and rich, was cut and seasoned, transforming into a feast worthy of the darkest celebration. Each slice was deliberate, each piece a reminder of the innocence lost, the bond shattered. When the preparations were complete, Alma set the table again, arranging the plates with care. The hearth glowed warmly, and she lit more candles, their flickering flames casting an eerie glow on the walls, illuminating the dark corners that whispered secrets of old. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, sending a shiver down her spine. The sound was too innocent, too ordinary after the horrors that had unfolded. She approached cautiously, the air thick with tension. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a fourth villager, a young woman named Eliza, her eyes wide with excitement. "Alma!" she exclaimed, her voice a mixture of joy and relief. "I heard about your feast. Everyone is talking about it. They want to come and—" Eliza's words died in her throat as she stepped inside, her gaze falling upon the remnants of the gruesome banquet. Horror washed over her face, eyes darting from the bloodied table to Alma's composed demeanor. What happened here?" Alma's smile was both warm and chilling. "I was just preparing the most exquisite dish, Eliza. You're just in time for the main course." Eliza staggered back, her breath hitching as she took in the scene. You can't be serious. What did you do?" Her voice trembled, each word like a knife, slicing through the silence. "Revenge is a dish best served cold," Alma repeated, the words dripping with malevolence. "And I've waited a long time for this." Eliza turned to flee, but Alma was quicker. She lunged forward, the knife glinting in the dim light. "You're not leaving, dear Eliza. You wanted to come to the feast, didn't you?" "No, please." Eliza's plea was drowned by Alma's laughter, a sound that resonated like a chilling melody. In that moment, as the blade met flesh, Alma felt an exhilarating rush, a surge of power unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was the culmination of years of suffering, the weight of her sister's death lifting as she exacted her final retribution. As the last villager fell, Alma stood among the remnants of her banquet, her heart pounding with both satisfaction and something darker, a hunger that could never be sated. She glanced around the cabin, the walls closing in around her like a hungry embrace. The fire crackled, and the shadows deepened, shifting and swirling as if they had come alive. Outside, the wind continued its mournful wail, a haunting serenade to the horrors that had transpired. Alma approached the table, now laden with the evidence of her vengeance, and began to serve the plates once more. The meal would be shared with those who still believed in her charm, those who would come seeking warmth and hospitality, blissfully unaware of the fate that awaited them. Thud! 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 The relentless pounding of the villagers' footsteps echoed in the distance. They had heard the commotion and were drawn in by the tantalizing scents wafting through the air. Alma smiled, her heart racing with anticipation. Come in, she called, her voice a syrupy invitation. There's plenty for everyone. The door creaked open, and a crowd of villagers entered, eyes wide with hunger and curiosity. They filled the room, oblivious to the truth that lingered in the air like a fog, thickening with every passing moment. Alma, we heard you have the best feast in the village, one man exclaimed, his hands rubbing together in excitement. What's cooking? Something special, she replied, the knife glinting ominously in the candlelight. You're just in time for the main course. As they settled around the table, Alma ladled the steaming broth into their bowls, the thick liquid swirling with the rich flavors of her revenge. They leaned in, inhaling the enticing aroma, unaware that they were partaking in the dark legacy of their past. The room filled with the sounds of slurping and satisfied murmurs, punctuated by the ominous creaking of the cabin, as if the walls themselves were watching in anticipation. Alma watched, her heart racing as the villagers devoured the meal, their laughter mixing with the echo of her sister's cries. Delicious, Alma, one villager exclaimed, wiping his mouth. You've outdone yourself. Why, thank you, Alma replied, a wicked grin spreading across her face. I hope you enjoy every bite. As the last bite was consumed, the atmosphere shifted. Confusion clouded their features as they began to piece together the horror that lingered in the air. The taste of the meat, rich and unfamiliar, began to twist in their stomachs. What did you put in this? One woman gasped, her face pale as realization dawned. Alma's laughter echoed through the cabin, chilling them to their core. The taste of revenge, my dear friends. A recipe that was passed down through generations. Screams erupted as the villagers realized the truth, panic spreading like wildfire among them. But Alma merely watched, her heart swelling with satisfaction, knowing that they would finally understand the cost of their ignorance. In that moment, as the chaos unfolded, she felt a strange sense of liberation. The years of pain, the nights spent mourning her sister, all washed away in this dark triumph. The laughter and screams intertwined, a macabre symphony that filled the cabin, resonating with the spirits of the past. Alma lifted the knife high, its blade gleaming in the dim light, and for a brief moment, she felt her sister's presence, urging her on. She plunged it into the heart of her final victim, the sound of the blade sinking deep, accompanied by the thud of flesh meeting steel. This is for you, Marin, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The villagers fell silent, the warmth of their laughter replaced by the chilling realization of their fate. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Alma knew that her revenge was complete. She had served her feast cold, and in doing so, had forged a bond with her sister that would transcend death itself. With a final glance at the remnants of the villagers, she turned away, stepping into the darkness of the forest beyond. The cabin, once a place of warmth and family, was now a monument to her vengeance, a haunting reminder of what lay hidden behind the veneer of hospitality. And as the moon rose high in the sky, casting its silver glow over the land, Alma disappeared into the night, leaving behind a chilling legacy of revenge and the echoes of laughter that would never again be heard. Deep in the heart of the Chaco forest, in that inhospitable region in the north of the province of Salta, Argentina, populated by indigenous peoples of various ethnicities, where the sun beats down mercilessly and the white wind carries dust of bones, myths, and forgotten stories, lies the place called Telakmak in the Wichi-Mataco language, which means grandma. Its name evokes uneasiness and fear, because there, under the shade of an old carob tree, rest not only the remains of an elderly Wichi-Mataco woman, but also the remains of the cold dish of revenge that she slowly savored before dying. The locals say that every time a summer storm hits the area, a headless ghost appears, looking for a hat that she lost. It all began many years ago, on a scorching January afternoon, when Nuhaya, an elderly Mataco woman, was struggling between life and death. Her body was battered, bent like a bush whipped by the northern wind, and the pain cut her breath like invisible knives. She knew she was running out of time, but before she left this world, she wanted to fulfill one last wish, to reach Yelaj, the village where her children and grandchildren lived. There, a respected shaman had the power to heal sick bodies and broken spirits, and Nuhaya hoped he would ease her suffering. However, reaching Yelaj was nearly impossible in her condition. After walking for hours across what seemed like endless terrain, she found shelter under a carob tree. The tree's gnarled, twisted roots rose from the ground like bony fingers, providing her with a makeshift seat. Exhausted and too weak to continue, she let herself fall into that wooden embrace, hoping some traveler would find her and take pity on her. Hours passed, and the oppressive midday heat was replaced by the stifling afternoon breeze. Just when Nuhaya thought no one would appear, she saw a cloud of dust in the distance, announcing the arrival of a rickety truck. When the vehicle stopped in front of her, her heart quickened with a spark of hope. Erigin Sandalo Anakin, the foreman of the Los Quilotes ranch, stepped out with his usual air of superiority. He was a tall, bony man, with suntanned skin and lips stained green from chewing coca leaves. Around his neck, a sweat-soaked handkerchief gleamed, and on his forehead rested his most prized possession, a Chicano hat made of rawhide with the initials S.A. delicately engraved in cursive. The hat, inherited from his grandfather, was his symbol of status and power. Unlike his ancestors, Experidian had forged his own law in the forest, a law in which the weak were not worth a second of his time. Amtina.t. Chivoya. Nuhaya murmured a greeting in her language. Good morning. How are you? It was like a whisper that faded into the wind, because she spoke with the little strength she had left. Experidian's eyes scanned the old woman from head to toe with disdain. The gleam of contempt reflected in his pupils, and a twisted smile crossed his face. Without bothering to reply, he spat a greenish spit that missed Nuhaya's cheek by inches. The viscous liquid landed in the sand, a symbol of what she represented to him. Nothing. Take me? Ah. To Yelash, Nuhaya pleaded with a broken voice. The foreman snorted, and without even speaking a word to her, adjusted the load, got back into the truck, and sped away in fury, kicking up a cloud of dust that enveloped the old woman, choking her. The engine roared, and the vehicle drove off, leaving only an echo of indifference and scorn in the air. As the dust cloud settled around her and the sound of the engine faded away, Nuhaya felt a spark ignite inside her. It was a dark spark, born of resentment and humiliation, that soon transformed into something more. The certainty that she had to respond to that act with the only weapon she had left, the Taie, the posthumous revenge of the Ahat, the spirits of the dead. The old woman closed her eyes, and with hot words, loaded with hatred, cast her curse upon him. May death in the white wind come for you, and may your bones scatter on the earth like sand in the river. May the forest devour you and spit you out again and again into the earth. You will never find rest, doomed to wander, searching for your head and your hat. That night, Nuhaya died beneath the carob tree, completely alone, with the dust of humiliation still clinging to her skin, and the words of the curse stuck to her lips, frozen in a scream of pain and fury. Her family found her body at dawn, stiff and cold like marble, twisted by the last worms of pain. Fulfilling her wish, they gathered her ashes and buried them at the foot of the carob tree, giving the place the name Telak Mok, grandmother's ashes. However, the story did not end with Nuhaya's death. A few days after Nuhaya's burial, Experidian Sandalio Anakin was driving his truck on a road near the area. He had completely forgotten about the old woman, but he didn't understand why she kept appearing in his dreams. Her wrinkled face, her sickly yellow eyes, the creaking of her old bones, and the words of her greeting echoing in his mind. And then, something strange happened. That day, the steering wheel began to vibrate, and an icy wind blew through the windows, making him shudder. He saw a flock of crows appear out of nowhere, circling overhead, flying around the vehicle and over his head. The birds cawed deafeningly, as if announcing an ill omen. Somehow, the steering wheel slipped from his hands and jerked violently to the side. The truck skidded and rolled down a steep ravine. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and everything went silent in that harsh land, scarred by injustice and historical neglect. When the ranch workers arrived at the scene of the accident, they found a wrecked truck. But something was missing. Experidian's body lay crushed under the wreckage, but his head was nowhere to be found. They searched for days, even bringing in tracking dogs, but they found no trace of the foreman's head. And the strangest thing of all, the hat, his prized hat, was missing as well. Since then, locals and hunters passing by Telak Mok on stormy nights have reported seeing an Ahat, a wandering ghost, roaming aimlessly, with its body hunched forward as if searching for something. Some say that it appears behind people, and in a hoarse voice asks them, "Haven't you seen my hat? It has the letters E.SA engraved on it. Without it, I cannot rest." And they say the spirit continues searching for his hat and his head, unable to find peace. Nuhaya's taiyaj was fulfilled, as always happens with curses uttered with true hatred. The revenge, cold as the earth covering the old woman's ashes, was served in due time. Because revenge, after all, is a dish best served cold, and when it arrives, it leaves nothing uneaten. Dear, try nigh. When I come through the door, Amy is laying on the couch, the news lighting up the living room, weeping into one of Jason's shirts. I do my best to ignore her. Ignore the grief welling in my own throat, and head to the kitchen. I reach in my bag as I start to lay out all the ingredients that I brought. I glance up at the television. Jason's missing person picture and information flashes across the screen. Amy lets out a strangled cry. Frustration bubbles up in my chest. If she would just put in an effort to find him, he was her son after all. I push it down. She was my sister, and she was in pain. Right now, all I needed to do was cook her a pan of lasagna. I reached my hand in the bag for the last ingredient, and find the bag empty. No ground beef. Shit. Amy? I say tenderly. She peeks her head over the couch. Do you have any ground beef? She stops crying, resorting to rapid sniffling long enough to nod, and let out a strangled response. In the freezer. All right. I say softly. She retreats behind the back of the couch, her weeping returning, though it seems like it's starting to slow. She might actually cry herself to sleep. I've seen a lot of things, but I have never seen a grown woman cry herself to sleep. I retreat to the garage of her house. The white rectangular block of a freezer was tucked into the corner. I walk over to it, opening it, and searching through the bags of frozen soup. Homemade tomato sauce stored for a rainy day. Just below a bag so full with food that it's hard to pick up lies an unlabeled bag of what appears to be ground beef. There's 7 other bags with equally strange cuts of meat, some ground, some strips. I stop digging halfway down the freezer, glancing at the bag of meat with a frown. Screw it. She never labels her bags. If it isn't ground beef, then it's some other form of meat that she trusted to someday ingest. She probably won't eat this anyway. I return everything but the bag of ground beef to the freezer and shut the lid, dragging my feet as I reach the garage door and enter back into the house. Amy moved. She's sitting at the kitchen table. Straight left of the kitchen, she still stares at the television, her eyes dull and red with crying. I do my best to ignore her as I put the bag of meat in the sink, running hot water over the frozen meat. As I gather the rest of the ingredients, getting ready to start making the food, Amy falls asleep, her head leaning on the table, wrapped in a blanket that she dragged from the couch. I sigh quietly, taking the bag from under the water and bringing it over to the pan that I'd warmed up. I put the still half-frozen meat in the warming pan. Amy snored on the table as I watched frost leap off the odd meat. Slowly, it defrosted enough to cook. Then it started to hiss from its place in the pan, browning. It smelt different. The closest thing I could come up with was pork being grilled over charcoal. When I had finished layering the pasta noodles, the sauce, and the strange meat, I slipped it into the oven. Then I began to clean up. I went to grab the plastic bag that had held the meat. I grabbed it, heading towards the trash, when a slip of paper fell out of the bag. I stop, bending down to pick it up. Amy's handwriting was a messy scrawl. It spelled out a date and a few words. 4/12/13. Left arm. April the 12th. That was the day before she reported Jason missing. I put the empty bag on the counter, slipping the paper into my pocket. I glanced at Amy. She was still asleep. Quietly, I slipped into the garage, curiosity, but more importantly, dread. I had miscounted. There were 8 other bags. Not 7. Slowly, I opened each one. They all had the same date. Each one labeled a different part of a body. A human body. One of them had a time recorded as well. 42 minutes before Amy called in Jason as missing. She put a human heart in a bag, a human heart small enough to belong to a missing boy. Small enough to belong to Jason. I gape at the assortment before me. Shakily, I stand up. Quickly, I rebag all the organs, shoving the pieces of paper in my pocket, and stuff them back in the freezer, shutting it quickly. I move swiftly towards the door, my breath shaking. When I open it, I turn to walk out of the house, ready to run. Amy stands in front of me, blocking my way past her. She holds the empty bag that I'd set back down. "Are you all right?" Amy asks. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She cocks her head, not a bit of concern on her face. My heart is beating so quickly, I think it will explode. Yes. I breathe. I just wanted to grab something out of my car. I make a move towards the door. Amy grabs my arm, stepping in front of me. "Of course," she said detachedly. Then she glanced the direction of the garage. "What were you doing in there, Cece?" I cringe at the nickname. "Nothing," I say shortly. Amy smiles at me. "Nothing?" "Nope." "Then why?" She began, cocking an eyebrow. "Do you have one of my little labels in your pocket?" Phoebe could only fiddle with her food, their first meal together, in their first home together. She'd shrugged off the unease she felt on stepping into her husband's cottage, rented for years, whilst he served abroad. Something about it was getting under her skin. "There's nothing wrong with this place. Laura talked rubbish about feeling weird round here. Give it time." At the mention of his ex-wife, Phoebe looked at her new husband, struggling with his chopsticks before giving up and reaching for a fork. He looked tired, rings around his eyes, stubble shading his jawline. Sighing, she pushed the takeaway containers aside. Ravenous before ordering the meal, her appetite now faded. "We didn't move too fast, did we? Me selling my place? Don't tell me you're having second thoughts." She tilted her head to one side and smiled. "About us getting married? Absolutely not. About moving into your cottage, I didn't have first thoughts because you'd already decided. Finish up my food, please. I'm not hungry. Shame to waste it. I'll put the kettle on." Her chair squeaked as she went to the sink. Boxes of kitchenalia were stacked neatly, methodically labeled by Wilt. She dug out the kettle, toaster, some crockery and cutlery to tide them over until she could get stuck into unpacking properly over the coming week. "Did you put the mugs back in the box?" Phoebe turned to Wilt, who was checking his phone, digging into her kung po chicken. "Nope. I've not touched a thing except for getting the boxes in order. The removals firm didn't have a clue. Your boxes for the bedroom were in the porch for some reason." She frowned. "Weird. I checked them upstairs and made sure everything was ticked off." Will laughed. "I bet you did. So why were they in the porch?" He shrugged, shoveling in another mouthful of rice. "Maybe you missed a couple." Phoebe opened the box marked cups, mugs, teapot. "They're here. The ones I took out this afternoon. See what I mean?" Wilt put his fork down. "No, I don't see what you mean. We're both knackered. Things are upside down because we've just moved in. I'll clear up. You go grab a shower." He reached out to her hand resting on the table, but Phoebe withdrew it sharply. She wasn't so tired she didn't know what she'd unpacked and what she hadn't. "I'll make us a cuppa. Go on. You look exhausted." He leaned in for a kiss, but she pushed past him, shaking her head. "Bonnie's coming over next week. If there's something off about this cottage, she'll know." Hash. Phoebe lay in bed, wide awake and staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind whistling through the trees outside. Despite feeling exhausted, she'd got into bed and couldn't sleep. She found her slippers and headed to the bathroom when she stopped at a sound coming from downstairs. Something being dragged across the kitchen tiles. Momentarily she thought about waking Wilt, but gave herself a mental slap. She was a senior army officer. She'd witnessed myriad horrors of an earthly nature, and wasn't given to flights of fancy. A scraping sound made her stop dead as she went downstairs. The sound was clear and loud, coming from the open door to the kitchen. There was definitely someone moving about. Despite herself, she felt scared. Quietly, heart pounding, she reached the hallway. It was pitch black, no suitably eerie moon and no streetlights to provide any second-hand illumination. The kitchen door was ajar, so with a gentle push she reached around to feel for the light switch. Jesus! What the hell was going on? The dining table had been moved to the center of the kitchen floor, the chairs piled up on the tabletop, precariously balanced. Phoebe gaped, back pressed to the wall. The ceiling light, temporarily sporting a single bulb, swung ever so slightly from side to side, as if caught by a draft. She walked smartly to the kitchen window and checked the latch. It was closed tight. She tried the back door. Locked. The only other way anyone could have left was through the lounge. So she hurried in, turning on the light. It was as they'd left it. Boxes neatly stacked, furniture covered in dust cloths carefully pushed up against the wall. She weaved through, towards the only other route out of the cottage via the conservatory door. It too was locked. She placed her hand on the cold window to peer into the garden. Nothing. If this was Wilt's idea of a practical joke, she'd kill him. Spooked, Phoebe turned to go, ask him what the hell he thought he was doing when a cold draft brushed past her neck. She put her hand on the spot where she'd felt the breeze and looked round. A shadow seemed to move between the boxes, towards the kitchen door. It happened so fast she wasn't sure if it wasn't just tired eyes seeing things. She felt the breeze again, closer this time, like breath upon her neck, followed by a deep, rasping voice. "Get out!" Phoebe waved Wilt off as he scrambled gravel, leaving for a month's tour of duty in Germany. He sounded the horn as he pulled onto the lane. All she was left with was birdsong, the rattle of the dry autumn leaves in the breeze, and the distant thrum of motorway traffic. Normality. Wrapping her arms around herself, she turned and looked at the house. It was the perfect epitome of a quaint English country cottage. Whitewashed walls, windows made up of little panes. The only newish addition was a small porch draped in climbing plants she presumed were roses with possibly an entwined clematis. She could see why he loved it and why he hadn't sold it but rented it out after he and Laura divorced. He dismissed her story about the voice, suggesting she see the Army psych team. Warily, she went back indoors, avoiding the kitchen where she got a bad vibe. She thought she heard a noise. It came again. A knock. Trying to control her breathing, she climbed the creaking stairs. At the top, she waited. Again, a knock. A rap, like knuckles on a hard surface. She checked the smaller bedroom they'd selected as their home office. Again, a rap. She looked into the spare bedroom. It was plainly decorated, neutral bedding, no pictures on the walls. Her kids might stay here if they ever spoke to her again. They loathed Wilt. Again, a rap, this time closer. Phoebe edged her way into their bedroom with its sloping ceilings and uneven wooden floors. A sharp rap at the window made her turn. It was fleeting, and a dark shadow beyond the glass seemed to dissolve as soon as she saw it. With a trembling hand, she slowly unlatched the handle to see if anything was outside. Nothing, just that straggly rose bush. She breathed deeply, telling herself off for being so daft. Wilt could get the loppers out when he was back. Phoebe gave the duvet a shake and plumped the pillows, shaking her head. Why was she so skittish? Turning, she found the bedroom door closed. Weird, she thought. It was open a second ago. Another noise made her spin, a low groan in the corner near the window. A large, shadowy shape filled her vision, a gasp at her ear. When did this happen? Phoebe had found some emergency cigarettes in her car and was outside when Bonnie arrived. Drawing deeply, she closed her eyes and shook her head. The kitchen, A moment ago. That's why I'm out here. I ran down the stairs after I heard the voice and saw the state of the place and... Trailing off, Phoebe shook her head. It's nuts. You understand, right? You believe me? She smiled as Bonnie wrapped a comforting arm around her shoulder and gave her a hug. I'll help clear up. Phoebe stood in the doorway as Bonnie put all the strewn contents of the cupboards and drawers back where they belonged. Whatever it is, it's messy. You saw a dark figure? Phoebe shook her head. Not a figure. A mass. A shadow of some kind. I don't know, Bon. I'm not up on these things like you. She watched Bonnie fill the kettle and grab a couple of mugs. Bonnie was her daughter's friend from school. The kid who got picked on for being odd, a goth, a professional ghost hunter, or whatever it was. They'd stayed in touch, and hearing about her relationship collapsing, the miscarriage and what happened in London, she'd offered Bonnie a place to recharge. Can you sense anything? Something's here. Phoebe shuddered. She didn't take her eyes off the young woman with her dyed hair and Doc Martens in a Sparks t-shirt. I can, but... Bonnie looked about her. It's a very pretty cottage. Will did good. Phoebe shrugged. Didn't say it was haunted, did he? Doesn't bode well, does it? She let Bonnie pour the milk. The tea looked a bit weak, but she was grateful to have company. Give me the tour, then. Phoebe led her into the lounge. You said it started the night you both moved in. Went quiet last week. Then you've had issues today? Phoebe nodded. Bonnie asked, It's been okay with Wilt here, apart from the first night. She nodded again, then shook her head. Bon, I had a bad feeling even before we moved in. Second thoughts about selling my house and moving into the home he had with Laura. We should have bought something fresh somewhere. Second thoughts about the marriage. Phoebe didn't bite. She hadn't said that. We were fine as we were. Tap, 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 dot. A rapping sounded from upstairs. Both women froze, Phoebe's eyes on Bonnie. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time. The chimney breast shook, photos in frames visibly juddering. Is this what you heard before you saw that shape? Bang, bang, dotty. The door rattled on its hinges. Stay here. Bugger that. Phoebe followed Bonnie as she raced through the kitchen and up the stairs. Our room is... Don't tell me. Bonnie took a turn at the top of stairs and listened. Bang! The house shook. Phoebe gripped the banister as Bonnie found the bedroom and went in. As when the sun goes behind a cloud on an autumn day, a chill descended. Silence. Phoebe watched as Bonnie stood in the doorway and looked about her. The same cold breath she'd felt earlier blew down the nape of her neck, an indistinct whisper passing by. The bedroom door slammed shut. Bon? There was no reply. Phoebe grabbed the door handle, but it resisted. Bonnie, what's happening? There was a sudden clawing sound across the inside of the door, and the sunlight from the landing window seemed to dim. The temperature dipped further, and Phoebe let out a cry as something small and sharp hit her on the back of her head. She looked down at the rug. A button. Then another hit her, and another. The door flew open, and Bonnie stepped out, holding one side of her face, motioning for Phoebe to move downstairs fast. What happened? Phoebe turned to look at Bonnie, stumbling slightly at the foot of the stairs. In there. Bonnie pointed at the kitchen door, and then nearly ran into Phoebe's back as she pulled up sharp. The kitchen table was upturned, and balanced on its legs were the 4 chairs, swaying ever so gently. Phoebe didn't get tearful. She was made of rocks and iron. She didn't run away. She took control and stood her ground. This, though. I can't stay here. Bonnie, with a worried expression, took the older woman's hands. This house doesn't want to be a home. Phoebe wouldn't sit at the upright kitchen table as she and Bonnie half-heartedly shared a couple of rounds of sandwiches. There's an angry presence. Phoebe knew Bonnie was trying hard to sensitively convey the madness. The young woman had scratches across her cheek, as if she'd caught herself on thorns. Look, I'm happy to call Wilt and tell him that I'm not staying here. I'm sure we can get married quarters on the base, or we can rent somewhere temporarily. Do something practical, she told herself, a project to focus on, that clear my head, ground me, escape the insanity. Don't rush into anything. Let me at least try and communicate with it. Phoebe wasn't convinced. If you'd asked me a week ago whether I believed in ghosts or hauntings or whatever, I'd have laughed in your face. No offense. Bonnie smiled, letting her friend continue. It hurt you. If it can trash a kitchen, make walls shake, shout in my ear and harm you of all people, then I'm happy to stop occupying someone else's home. I clearly wasn't meant to be here. Let me try. It was dusk, and night was creeping in. A fox barked in the field nearby, a sound that freaked Phoebe out. Sit at the table with me. There's a lot of energy centered here in the kitchen. Phoebe had opened a beer and perched herself on the edge of a chair, ready to make her escape. Do we need to turn the lights off or something? Bonnie shook her head. Nah, it doesn't make any difference. One of the other chairs began to wobble of its own accord. Wide-eyed, Phoebe inched away from it. Ignore it. It's just attention-seeking. Draining her can, Phoebe popped another. Okay. If I look like I'm in a trance or asleep, don't try and wake me. Nodding, Phoebe was drawn to something in the corner of her eye. She turned, but it was gone. She observed Bonnie's eyes closing as she clutched one of the manifested buttons, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. The lights overhead flickered briefly. Just on the edge of hearing was the faintest whisper. A furious voice. Something or someone was very angry. Bonnie's lips began to contort before she shouted in a hard voice, "Get out!" Phoebe put her can down to prevent spilling it. The light overhead flickered again, as did the clocks on the microwave and stove. The radio burst into life, music blaring before stopping, Bonnie's rapid breathing the only sound. Phoebe realized her teeth were chattering. It was bitterly cold. Bonnie spoke in her own voice, quietly and calmly, as if to someone in another room. Why can't you leave? Tilting her head, she appeared to be listening to a reply. This isn't your home anymore. Let this couple take care of it from now on. Bugger that, Phoebe muttered under her breath. A kitchen drawer slid open, rattling cutlery. Phoebe jumped when her phone lit up. A message from Wilt. Hi, love, arrived safely? Has Bonnie arrived to exorcise the old pile? Always wondered why the letting agent was forever chasing tenants, forfeiting their deposits because they upped and left. Got lots on this evening. Call tomorrow. Wilton East. A chair slid backwards into the cupboards and fell with a clatter. She reread the message. Chasing tenants who walked out. In the kitchen. Bonnie. I screwed up, shook her head, trying to catch what was being said. Slow down. In here. She gave a huge sigh, then nodded. I understand. The lights went out, leaving Phoebe with just her phone to see by. The tap-tapping began again overhead, growing louder until it became a rhythmic tattoo of banging, making the plates rattle. Phoebe, that was Bonnie's real voice, wasn't it? I think we should step outside. Phoebe's office on the base was small, but neat. She'd not been sure about a desk job after all the years of active service, but, for now, it felt right. Her phone rang. He's here. Send him in. The door opened without a knock, and a confused and angry Wilt stormed in, wearing a... What the hell? expression. Are you crazy? When were you going to tell me? She could barely look at her husband and wasn't doing a good job of concealing her anger. I've flown back because you said it was urgent, life or death. Do you know the hoops I had to go through, how many favors I've had to call in? Why didn't you tell me about the cottage, the home you created with your first wife? What happened to her? Laura? She's living with some guy in Milton Keynes. You met her at that Christmas party. Not Laura, she was number 2. Wife number 1? Kathy Rossley Negant? She pointed at the copy of a marriage entry on her desk. Home address? The cottage? Axum Green? Ring any bells? She watched Wilt's eyes flick between her desk, her face, her pen, the window behind her. Outside, there was more activity than usual for this backwater army base. Kathy Rossley went missing 15 years ago. Wilt swallowed. They brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. He didn't reply, distracted by military police vehicles in the car park. Uniformed personnel were heading their way. I was a bit taken aback, to be fair, having the front porch dug up. Them finding old bin bags of clothes, jewelry, bones. His jaw moved up and down. There was a knock at the door. Your dead wife was desperate to tell us all about you, what you did, dismembering her body on the kitchen table. Bonnie had an illuminating chat with Kathy. Wilt's breathing was loud, anxious. He knew he was trapped. This is bullshit. I don't believe in ghosts. The police don't either. They've got forensic evidence. Phoebe fixed her eyes on her husband. The police want to talk to you. Phoebe, listen. Rain hammered against the windows, each droplet tapping like an impatient visitor. Sarah sat on the edge of her couch, scrolling through an online marketplace for vintage trinkets, a hobby she'd developed to pass the time. She paused on an old locket, golden, delicate, but worn by time. The caption read, "An heirloom with a story waiting to be discovered." Without thinking twice, she bought it. Something about it felt oddly familiar. 2 days later, the locket arrived. She sat at her kitchen table, holding it between her fingers. It was heavier than she'd imagined. Gently, she pried it open. Inside was a small, sepia-toned photo of a young woman. Her features were soft, her eyes deep and distant. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the locket looked exactly like her. She slammed the locket shut, heart racing. A sense of unease crawled under her skin. There had to be a mistake. Maybe it was a coincidence, a relative she didn't know about, some long-lost ancestor. She picked up her phone and dialed her mother. "Mom?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did we have any relatives that looked like me, from way back?" "Not that I know of, sweetie," her mother replied. "Why? Is something wrong?" Sarah hesitated. I bought this old locket. It has a picture in it, and the woman looks just like me." "That's strange. Maybe it's just a resemblance. People do say we have doppelgangers." Sarah nodded, though her mom couldn't see her. "Yeah, maybe." That night, Sarah tossed and turned in bed. The image of the woman in the locket haunted her thoughts. She finally gave in to the insomnia and got up, deciding to examine the locket more closely. There had to be some explanation. An inscription, a name, anything. She reached for it, fingers shaking slightly, and opened it again. This time, there was something different. Beneath the photo, etched into the inner rim, were faint initials. S.R. Sarah froze. Those were her initials. She dropped the locket on the table as though it had burned her. "This can't be happening," she whispered, backing away. "It's just a stupid coincidence." Just as she turned to leave the room, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "How's my locket, Sarah?" She stared at the screen, cold dread crawling up her spine. She hadn't told anyone about the locket. Her fingers trembled as she typed a response. "Who is this?" Moments later, another message came through. "I think you know." The air around her seemed to thicken, the shadows in the room growing deeper. Her heart pounded in her ears as she rushed to the front door, checking the locks. She was alone, but every instinct told her she wasn't safe. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. The woman from the locket, standing outside Sarah's house. Sarah's breath caught. She rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain ever so slightly. The street was empty, drenched in the downpour, but there was no one there. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. "Sarah!" A soft voice called from the other side. "Let me in." She stepped back, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I'm you," the voice replied, gentle but distorted, like a familiar melody played out of tune. "You just don't remember. Yet." Sarah's hands shook as she backed away from the door. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare look at it this time. Instead, she grabbed the locket and hurled it against the wall. The metal shattered into pieces. Instantly, the room grew silent. The knocking stopped. The phone went dark. For a moment, it was as though time itself had paused. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The reflection's grin widened unnaturally, stretching across its face. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, paralyzed by fear. Desperate, she grabbed her phone and dialed her mother again, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely press the buttons. As the call connected, a voice answered, not her mother's, but her own. "You can't run from yourself, Sarah." The voice on the other end of the line said, eerily calm, "It's time you remember." The phone went dead in her hand. The room felt like it was closing in on her. Sarah stumbled toward the mirror, hoping to see something, anything, that might explain what was happening. But her reflection was wrong. The woman staring back at her was still smiling, her eyes no longer soft, but sharp and menacing. It felt like 1,000 eyes were watching her, every shadow now hiding a secret she didn't want to discover. The reflection began to move, not in sync with her but independently, as if it had a life of its own. Sarah's breath quickened as she reached toward the mirror, her fingers trembling. When her hand touched the cold glass, her reflection leaned in and whispered, "You've forgotten what you did, but I haven't." Her mind raced. What I did. The room plunged into total darkness for a moment, and when the lights flickered back on, Sarah saw something that made her heart seize. The shattered pieces of the locket were gone, replaced by a perfect replica of the locket sitting in the middle of the floor, intact, pristine, as though it had never been broken. She bent down, hand trembling, and when she picked it up, the weight in her palm felt heavier. The locket clicked open on its own, revealing a new photograph. This time, it wasn't the woman inside. It was Sarah herself, but older, her eyes hollow, her face twisted with the same eerie smile that haunted her reflection. "Now you understand," the voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "Time to come home." Behind her, the door creaked open slowly, the air turning colder. Sarah stood frozen, knowing that whatever waited beyond that door wasn't human, but it was coming for her.